Welcome back to the Classical Architecture Workshop. My name is Professor Brandon Rowe, and in this workshop we're going to be looking at mastering light in architecture. This is part 3, and we're going to be specifically looking at different mediums for conveying shade and shadow. In particular, we're going to look at marker techniques, watercolor techniques, as well as graphite or pencil shading techniques. Let's begin. What I'd like to demonstrate in this little illustration is how different mediums can convey shade and shadow. So this one here on the left was created with 3 different Prismacolor markers. I've got one that's an 80% warm gray, that's my darkest. I've got a 60% warm gray, and as well as a 30% warm gray. And so I used these on this. First, the 60% was the majority of the shadows. Once I had those outlined, I went ahead and used that marker to get the majority of the shadow lines on there. The 80% is really just touching up here and there a couple of really dark areas, trying to get a little bit of outline on this area, going in between the dentals a little bit and in between some of the medallions, as well as a couple highlight spots on the Corinthian capital itself. And then finally the lightest, the 30%, this was used to mostly try to convey a little bit of shadow here on the column shaft itself, since it's has a curvature on it. Same with some of the lighter shadows underneath the column capital itself, and softening some of these other molding shadows, as well as some of the base moldings in the pedestal, the recessed panel there as well. Now, as we move to the middle, this was done with watercolor. So you can get a sense of real quickly what marker is looking like compared to watercolor. And then the last is just graphite pencil. So with watercolor, I created a wash just using a typical ivory black here, and that was the most concentrated version of that, and so that was my darkest shadows, and I was using that just as I was the 60% along here. And I'm going to demonstrate how to apply a watercolor wash with shade and shadow in just a moment. But you can see here some of those areas where we left without the shade. Then I used my trusty little measuring tool, got just some water in here with some of my paint, and was able to put 2 parts water to create the lightest wash, and that is what the majority of the shaft is, as well as this wall back here all the way down. So that is the color of the wash all the way down. And then created one that was just 1 part water to help blend some of these other items in here. And then went to just a more dense black to add a couple of these highlights under the column capital, in between the dentals, and the medallions, etc. And then last but not least, this last example on the far right here, this was done using just a couple of different pencils with their different hardness, graphite. So the lightest was a 2H. That was used to apply just a general layer if we're doing the watercolor, a base layer, we would say. And then I had a 2B, and this was done for the majority of the shadows. So on the column shaft, along the entablature, any of those shadow projections. And then lastly, the darkest was a 6B, and that was used to really just clarify this edge here as it goes up, as well as the edge of the entablature and some of the dentils. So there you have it, 3 different mediums: graphite pencil, watercolor in the middle, as well as just marker on the very end. In this tutorial, we're going to apply a wash along this simple design for an Ecole. What you're going to note is how we apply the wash, number 1. It's a fairly simple technique. But what I've got here pre-mixed is I've got I use some ivory black to create my base wash up here. That's going to be used for my shadows. Then I added 2 parts water to it to create a more diluted version of that. That's going to be used as my base coat for my wash on any areas that are not necessarily in shadow. And then I've created another more concentrated version of the black ivory, and that's going to be used specifically to do a couple of highlights on the capital itself, between some of the medallions at the top, the dentils, as well as shade in this large opening. So let's get started. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and work on applying this large base coat. And this base coat I'm going to do for any of the areas where that are not going to be in shadow. So just as we did in the previous demonstration on using the 45-degree rule to map onto our facade any areas that would be in the shade or the shadow. So I've done that already. And so this wash that we're going to apply is going to be anywhere where we have just normal sunlight touching. So all of these medallion areas here. And one of the key elements to think about as you're doing the wash is you want this to be as even as possible. And so to do that, you want a fairly large round brush, and you are going to try to keep a bead on the end of this without letting it dry as you go back and forth. So otherwise you'll start to get some streak marks here and there. So that's good. We were able to get the entablature done. We're going to attack this in larger elements, so we're going to do this column capital, as well as the column on the left. Since right adjacent to this is going to be a fairly dark shadow line. And this is a quick demonstration. If I was doing this at another time, I would take more time. Okay, got that one side done. Now let's do this other side. Start up here at the top. The column capital. Want to work this wash down. I'm going to capture this pedestal. Okay, not too bad. All right, so how quickly that was accomplished. Now I've got another, that wash that I was just putting on was a 2 parts water. This next one is just a 1 part water. This one's a little bit darker, and we are going to be applying this specifically to any of the areas on this flat surface behind the Ecole. So I'm going to get any areas here that are not necessarily my shadows. The key here is to make sure you continue on both sides. Okay, got that side. Let's jump back over here to this side. Okay, now that we've got that, we're going to go ahead and apply some to this base area. As well as the bottom part of this pedestal. Okay. Now we're going to get the top part of the Ecole. This little pediment here. Because I know that inside this opening it's all going to be very dark, I'm not going to worry too much about that. Getting any wash in there right now. Okay. All right. From there, we're going to go back and get some of our shadow wash. So you notice that we started with the lighter first. So this top part, cymatium, is going to have a darker shadow on it. And then in between the medallions, bring that down just a little bit further where those fillet moldings are. Okay, and then anything below the medallions, all of these moldings are going to be in shadow. Same with all the dentals. And just a little bit onto the frieze. If you can notice, each of these little medallions has a little shadow line that continues past there. Okay, now that we've got that all taken care of on the entablature, we're now going to run the shadow line because all of this entablature actually pops forward So we're going to have a shadow on this side of it. We're going to apply that shadow. And we're also going to apply the shadow right under here, underneath the entablature. I'm going to keep this bead of water rolling down. As I continue these projections, shadow projections, all the way down. All right. One thing that we forgot here at the top, so right at the top of the architrave, you have, sometimes it's referred to as the cornice of the architrave, but that area is in shadow. As well as this little molding right there in the middle. We'll go back over that cornice. All right. We're going to add a little bit of shadows underneath these acanthus leaves. On either side of the volute. Do this on both sides. Kind of let that dry. If we come down to the base molding, in that area where we've got the double scotia moldings, it's going to be fairly dark. I just added way too much on there. It's good to have a rag next to you, just in case. And then these moldings here, crowning moldings underneath the top of the the pedestal will have some shadow. Same with this recessed panel. And now I'm going to add a very faint shadow on the right side of the column, going all the way down, because as it curves away from the sun, the source of light, we'll have this shadow line on it. that one side done. Now let's do this one on the left. Under each of these torus molds, you'll have a little bit of a shadow as well. There at the bottom. Okay. Now that we've got those, let's go ahead and focus on the Ecole itself. So underneath this side of the pediment, you'll have a shadow. Shadow will continue, not as large. We will have some underneath this area here, as well as on the sides. We will have some shadow underneath these Cyma reversa moldings. And on the other side of this bracket here. There we go. Now let's go ahead and add our shadow wash to this entire opening in here. Okay. We'll come back in and darken that up. It's not as dark as it needs to be. Oops. Okay. So after we've got most of that completed, the next step is we're going to add, looks like some of those areas are not quite dry yet, but we're going to add a couple of darker emphasis, the darkest shadow points. Those are going to be done on each side of the brackets up here at the top, in between some of these dentals. So with this one, I'm going to grab a smaller brush. So it's finer detail that we're working with here. And I'm going to get my more concentrated version. I'm going to rotate this. I'm going to start away from me up here on the top. Okay, so here we're getting those darker shadows. For the medallions to help them really pop out. I might even create another little line of wash underneath those medallions. And then over on this side here, where we had that overhang, I'm actually going to use that darker wash to emphasize that that area is also in the shadow. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and add a couple more shadows for these dentals. So if you can see, it's really a matter of adding layer upon layer to the watercolor to be able to get this added sense of depth that we talked about earlier. It's starting to read fairly well. And using that more concentrated version, I'm also going to do a light line around the perimeter of, or this shadow side for the column. Just really just separating in many ways. Kind of just bleed it out. So I can get a real nice definitive separation between the column itself and those darker shadows. Okay. Now that we've got that, we're going to run another line of that darker shadow underneath that entablature. to really help clarify that shadow line. There we go, it's starting to pop already. It looks like the center of the opening for our Ecole is now dry, so I'm going to apply a darker layer in here to really emphasize that this is an opening. I should have switched to my larger brush. Let me do that really quickly. The important thing when you're doing this is you want to make sure that any adjacent washes that you've done are dry. Otherwise, the watercolor will just leak right into it, your other surfaces. And I should have probably gone side to side instead of just vertical on this. That's okay, we'll go back over that. Okay, so now just a couple of last minute highlights on our capitals. They look dry now. And I'm mostly going to do these really dark ones on the side away from the sun on some of those acanthus leaves, in between some of the volutes. Because as you recall, these are folding away from us. Okay, and I'll also add a couple of those dark highlights here underneath on the side of this bracket here. It's well within that pediment area. All right. So I'm looking at this, just double checking if there's any areas we may have missed. What we'll add here, this frame is not going to be just completely flat. It will have some moldings. I'm going to use my general shadow in here. To add a little bit more depth. This is going around the perimeter there. I think that's good. We'll call that good. So you can see pretty quickly we did that in about 30 minutes or so. So not too long to, and this is a fairly large watercolor. This is 18 inches by 12 inches. So you can see how really quickly you could apply a wash, get some of your shade and shadow going on there. Oh, the one last thing we did forget. I'm going to do an extra layer of my darkest shadow for this opening. There we go. We'll call that complete. Thanks for joining us with the Classical Architecture Workshop. Come back another day and join us again.